Hi, Mark.
Good luck.
Uh, yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to do this talk. Um, I've been working at Imperial since August 2018, and the project I work on is is called Nature Smart Cities. Now I'm having some. There we are. It's an Interreg funded project. So it's funded by the European Union, and it works in France, Belgium, Netherlands, and the southeast of the UK. My bit of the project involves 8 city partners and 3 academic partners. All of the city partners work in smaller cities, which the purposes of this project means cities of less than 550,000 population. And the work, the project that I'm involved in is more than just my research. It also includes a number of pilot green infrastructure projects, which are intended to act as testbed projects and demonstrator projects for a business model, which is the main purpose of the project. So here is the geography of Nature Smart Cities. You can see the 7 city authorities here. The 8th one is the province of Antwerp. And Antwerp's a little bit misleading on this map because actually the city of Antwerp is not a partner, but some smaller authorities that band together for a variety of purposes are part of the project. That's called the Antwerp Sociedrand, and it's essentially the ring of suburbs that are part of metropolitan Antwerp, but are actually independent local authorities. The academic partners aren't shown on this map. Imperial College is obviously one of those, but also the universities of Ghent and Antwerp are actively involved in the project. So my work was to run a research project and to report back on it. And these were my lines of inquiry. And incidentally, the pictures that accompany these slides are all pictures that are taken in the environment. So one line of inquiry was what aspects of green infrastructure are the most important ones to municipalities and decision makers in these smaller cities. Secondly, I was asked to look at what are the main barriers to implementing green infrastructure in these cities. What evidence might be needed to get support from funders, support from decision makers? Where does the money actually come from? And how useful are the wide variety of evidential tools that exist purported to support GI proposals? So I devised a script and an interview process to investigate these, and I got the customary ethical approval from Imperial. And the methodology which we adopted was a series of face-to-face, semi-structured interviews. Fortunately, I managed to complete all of these shortly before lockdown. So I was able to visit all of these cities and meet people in their own offices. The interview process used show cards and other stimulus materials. The sample was constructed using purposes sampling, which was linked to people's involvement in the infrastructure process. Either I chose the people from a list of officers and elected representatives at the authority, or somebody at the authority did it for me, or we did it between us using my knowledge of how local government is organised and making sure that I got a good balance of responsibility. The process included support for speakers of French and Dutch, including Flemish, although Most interviewees didn't actually ask for that. There were some who did. And an interviewer experienced in both this kind of methodology and in the context, local government context, that this project was all about, was appointed. And that would be me. I've been working in this kind of methodology for many years, and I also worked for over 20 years in and around local government. So from my perspective, I've got a pretty good background for this kind of research in this kind of context. That sampling process led to a mix of contributors. I ended up interviewing 53 different respondents. Well over half of those were just ordinary officers at a variety of grades, but mostly with some responsibility. 8 senior officers, they might have been directors or heads of service or the equivalent in European context. 8 project managers who are managing those pilot projects that I mentioned earlier, and 8 elected representatives. And those people came from 15 different organisations, mostly city authorities. The city implies a big size, and that wasn't the case for these, but also a couple of provincial bodies, a couple of county councils in the UK, all of them involved with these particular locations and in delivering green infrastructure within these locations.
Phil, I'm so sorry.
The total slide set from my report comes to more than 60 different slides, and I'm not going to subject you to that today. I want to focus down on a smaller set of findings that I think are perhaps the most significant and perhaps the most interesting to this audience. And the first of these is the understanding that there is of green infrastructure within a smaller city. I asked all of these respondents what they understood as the difference between green infrastructure on the one hand and green space or planting on the other hand. And perhaps one of the more significant findings is that there is no common understanding of what green infrastructure is. Now that's been identified before by academics, but it's interesting that it applies to at this level. It means that 2 people talking about green infrastructure, even within the same local authority, may not share the same understanding of the terminology. But as I say, that's not new. Academics identified this quite frequently. And although we've been practicing green infrastructure probably since the Garden City movement in the early 20th century, we still haven't agreed on a single widely recognized definition. But that doesn't mean that the components of a definition aren't present. And there was some recognition of some attributes of green infrastructure, and in particular, multifunctionality. The idea that a green installation, a green asset, can fulfill more than one role. This was by far the most common attribute that was mentioned by respondents. And multifunctionality also emerges as something that can be planned for, so that, for instance, a flood alleviation scheme may also provide recreational space, presumably when it's not functioning as a flood alleviation scheme. But it also can arise in an unplanned way. I found, for instance, a small green space in an Antwerp suburb that had been originally intended as a recreation space, but had failed, probably through neglect, and was now quite a lively area for biodiversity. Ecosystem services were much less well recognised, much less used as a term. But people did describe things that you could label as ecosystem services, such as water retention or cultural benefit. Ideas of connectivity were mentioned, the ideas that the different green elements can be linked. And the concept of connectivity was actually part of the green infrastructure process going on in Lille, which is where this picture comes from. Lille is developing a series of micro projects in an attempt to introduce green infrastructure connectivity into a densely urbanized area. And impact was also mentioned, particularly in relation to people. The green infrastructure was widely expected to have a positive benefit of some sort in relation to local residents. And we also asked not only what did the respondent think GI was, but we also asked, would your decision maker, the person who makes decisions in your authority about green infrastructure, would they recognise the description that you've given? And we found, as you might expect, a variety of levels of understanding of green infrastructure. So this is not what decision makers say, this is what respondents think their decision makers would say. Some had an excellent understanding, some were thought to be quite limited. But in general, it would be fair to say that decision makers are seen as less well informed than their professional officers. And perhaps that's inevitable. They're generally seen as a bit behind the curve, having to be helped, having to be encouraged. The engagement of decision makers is affected by three different things. One is the political challenge, the idea that, for instance, in a coalition administration, there might need to be trade-offs. When putting forward a GI proposal, you might need to concede something else as well. Similarly, in a multi-party system, you might have opposition from climate change deniers. At least two of these authorities have climate change deniers in positions of elected. There are also situations where politicians were not necessarily in full control over policy. So the lead politician on green infrastructure in Bruges is not a member of the same party as the mayor of Bruges. And that means that her success, which is considerable, is sometimes interpreted as threatening the stability of the coalition. There are practical challenges for politicians as well. The realities of governing often mean compromise. The scale of smaller cities means that there's limited capacity to influence policy or projects. And there are operational challenges because different aldermen, different councillors, different departments work on different priorities. And that makes the kind of integrated approach that GI really represents much more difficult to achieve. Some decision makers are just not that interested in doing the work necessary to operate across organisational and structural boundaries. We also found a certain amount of inconsistency. Authorities will make big, grand statements about climate change, make commitments to carbon capture and so on, but nevertheless persist with car-friendly policies. One person noted that their politicians make a lot of noise about carbon capture and climate change, but never travel by bus. Some decision makers are entirely, mainly cost-led, or you might say cost-driven. It's all about the money for them. So projects that attract external funding are more welcome than those that have to be funded locally. And they also tend to favour approaches where costs can be calculated in a credible way. And that's one of the problems with green infrastructure, that the costings are not nearly as reliable, not nearly as credible anyway, and are more speculative. That's one of the purposes of the project I'm working in, to try and create a business model that provides that kind of confidence and assurance. A lot of decision makers are risk averse. They don't take risks when public money is involved, and they don't take risks when public opinion is involved. And sometimes a green approach as opposed to a grey one would be seen as risky. They're short-termists as well. A 4-year electoral cycle in Europe and perhaps 3 years, perhaps 4 years in the UK, means that they often want quick results. And they also want visible results, things they can be photographed with, especially if local children can be included in the picture. That was true even of one politician who's been in office for over 20 years and whose position isn't under threat. He still wants to see visible results that he can put his name in. They often don't see beyond the visible impact to that more abstract kind of concept, such as carbon capture or adapting to the heat island effect and so on. They don't see that. They see they want things to be now, immediate, and as I say, visible. They don't see the opportunities that a green infrastructure project might embrace with a wider lens. For instance, in Cambridge, there's a very enthusiastic development of active travel policies, but it's been noticed that this approach has been damaging to local biodiversity. So the narrow focus has been missed. And there's a certain amount of tokenism. For instance, one authority has a scoring system in its planning approval process that gives you points if you've got green elements in your development plan. But because there's a very strong priority in that authority on building new houses, and because the government is financing and pressing for those new houses to be built, a low score on the green elements is conveniently ignored because the main priority of the project lies elsewhere. So that's all very discouraging. But are we at least moving in the right direction? Well, there's a sense that awareness of green issues is rising. The ideas are becoming more tangible, less abstract. Understanding is improving. And media attention is helping that. People like David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion are all putting climate and human response to climate issues in the headlines, and whatever else that's doing, it's certainly raising awareness. Direct experience is a helpful factor too, in a way. Cities in nature smart cities are discovering climate change directly, but not always with the same results. In this area of Lille, there was a very serious heat wave in 2018, and people died. That same heat wave affected the south of Holland, where people filled their swimming pools. So it's not always a given that a bad climate experience will increase awareness. Social media make it much more easy for the public to complain and to get support for a complaint. Social media, public opinion is not always well informed. Politicians are increasingly finding a need to respond, and that's helping to move climate issues up the local agenda. And external stakeholders are playing a part too. They can sometimes have quite a powerful influence, and it's not always a benign one. For instance, car owners. Car owners in Bruges are getting in the way of policies that might promote a pedestrianised city centre, for instance, such as they have in Ghent. Businesses in Southend are very resistant to any action that reduces parking space for either the town centre or the beach. Local business regards car owners, car drivers, as being its main customer base, and it doesn't want to see that challenge. Environmentalists are obviously pushing an environmental agenda, but not always in a holistic way. So we did find, for instance, environmental groups that were concerned about visitor numbers and how to manage visitors to natural sites, such as nature reserves. And an interesting one was UNESCO. Both Bruges and Lille, at the centres of the cities, are World Heritage Sites. And that seriously limits the action that the city councils can take to improve green infrastructure in those areas. So the Grand Place in Lille, for instance, which would benefit wonderfully from some trees to provide shade, that's not permitted because as a World Heritage Site, it has to be grey. It has to be consistent with the idea of Lille's reputation as the mineral city. There's also no connection with the vast academic output that's taking place in relation to green infrastructure. Thousands of academic papers are published on this subject, and there is no impact apparent from that output to this level of delivery in a smaller city. We looked at the priorities that smaller cities expect to achieve through green infrastructure. What outcomes are they seeking when they look at green policy proposals that come forward? Now, to explain what we did here, I want to just show a little methodology. This is what's called a closed card sorting exercise. People were given a mat with these three areas on. The Dutch here means on the left, a high priority. In the middle, a priority of some importance. And on the right, at the moment, not a priority at all. And people were given cards with different priorities on and asked to place them where they thought their council stood on each of the issues. So here, a more attractive place to live has been placed in the high priority area, but carbon capture has been placed in the low priority area, and improving public health has again been put here in this example in the high priority area. And I then scored the positioning of these cards. So 2 points for being on the left, 1 point for being in the middle, no points for being on the right-hand side. And that allowed me to calculate a mean score for each of the 12 priority cards that we gave people. And here's the results of that exercise. The highest possible score is 2, meaning that everybody said it was a very high priority. The lowest possible score is 0, meaning that everybody said it was not a priority at all. All but one of my respondents was able to do this, and that one has been excluded from the calculation. So in first place, we have an attractive place to live. 32 of the 52 respondents that are represented here place this as a high priority for their city. Now, that is not the main reason why you would develop a green infrastructure project. You would probably be looking for something that acts against a problem, an intervention of some sort, rather than simply beautifying the city. So that's really could be interpreted as being a little bit disappointing. But on the other hand, since most green infrastructure projects do make the place look nice, or do at least keep the place looking nice, it's an advantage that project proposers can exploit. It means that a project that's aiming at extreme weather resilience can also claim that it makes the place look nicer. And that is going to carry some weight with these decisions. About half of the people in this sample rated public health as a high priority, about the same active travel, recreation and investment. But there are variations in these results at city level. An attractive place to live is first in 3 cities and is never lower than the 4th highest priority in any of the cities. So it's clearly a major factor in promoting green infrastructure and in deciding to deliver it. Health is 2nd or 3rd in 3 cities and never comes below 6. And indeed, that may be much more important now since all of this work was done before coronavirus and before lockdown. Active travel comes 1st or 2nd in 4 cities, but is lower in the Netherlands because the Netherlands has a very large network of active travel already. It's been done. And active travel, for some curious reason, comes last in Southend. It's the 12th of the 12 cards there. At the other end, we've got four priorities that come in with relatively low scores. They're all below 1, which means that they're not really attracting any great attention. The heat island effect, carbon capture, land values, and noise pollution. It's interesting that these four things are either long-term or fairly abstract, or both. The one that you might expect to be higher up, increased land values, actually achieves a contrasting result. In Southend, that's a very high priority, where they're trying to gentrify Southend, make it more attractive. On the other hand, in Cambridge, increased land values are an enormous problem, and they're working very hard to try and contain the increase in land and property prices to make them more attractive to key workers. So some observations on this. There are variations in this data, but a lot of it is fairly consistent across the whole sample. So it's possible to draw some general conclusions here. But among the variations are variations within the cities themselves. So I suspect in those cities, corporate goals are not being very clearly expressed. Elected members, they tend to give higher scores generally, which makes me wonder, are the officers more cynical or are the officers more realistic? Is it part of the role of the elected member to be more positive, more enthusiastic, to see fewer difficulties? And I've noticed that investment priorities are not linked to green infrastructure pretty much in any of these cities. In fact, it's the opposite in some. The investment priority is housing, and rarely in those circumstances will it be housing with green elements. The investment priority may be highways, but again, that will rarely be highways with green elements. Green has to fight for its place in this canon. Attractiveness is seen as delivering other green infrastructure benefits. They might be social in terms of attracting or retaining residents. They might be economic in terms of a nice place to live, being a nice place to visit, and also a nice place to set up your business. And they may be environmental, such as biodiversity or flood alleviation. But the key ingredient in these is their attractiveness, and that's what might usefully be emphasized when putting a project forward and seeking to get support for it. The other benefits may feel important to the people who are writing the business case, but they may be less important to those who are making the decisions. It's interesting that health actually came second in that chart I just showed you, but some things that might contribute to health, such as, for instance, reducing pollution, don't come nearly as high in the chart. So there are questions about whether decision makers recognize the contributing elements that, for instance, pollution, air quality, might make to public health. And it was interesting that when they discussed weather resilience, respondents were usually focused on flooding. They didn't really talk to me much about either drought or heat. Flooding from rain, flooding from the sea, but only those cities that have serious problems with heat, such as Lille, raised that issue at all. And another characteristic of these priorities is that the more visible a result is, the more tangible a result is, and the more immediate a result is, the more likely it is to be fairly high up in that chart. Now, there was a comparative exercise looking at hierarchies of obstacles, and the same three maps: a serious obstacle on the left, an obstacle relatively easy to resolve in the middle, not an obstacle at all on the right. And again, 12 cards that they could distribute across the mats. And there are the results on obstacles. The most serious one is not funding, which is probably what we would all expect. Funding comes second. It comes second to conflicting priorities within the authority. So the inability of the authority to resolve differences between its own structural departments is the biggest obstacle to green infrastructure. Over half of respondents said that. Again, there are variations and consistencies in this. Conflicting priorities is high pretty much everywhere. Securing funding is high. It comes first quite often in some cities, but there is one city where it's extremely low, and that's Bruges, which describes itself as being a pretty well-off city. Anything it wants to do, it can do. It doesn't need to worry too much about funding. Developers, convincing developers that green is the way forward, that they should include green in their development plans, is high. It's first or second in 3 cities, but it's only ninth in South End for some reason. But proving the value of GI never comes lower than 6th. And as I said before, that's one of the key focuses of this project, is to work towards a model that actually helps to prove the value of green infrastructure. Again, variations and consistencies. Again, elected members are more optimistic. They think there are fewer obstacles, and they think the ones that are there are less serious. The conflicts over priorities focus particularly in 2 service areas, housing and highways. These are often departments in their own right within a smaller city, and the problem seems to be a very rigid separation of responsibilities and obligations. Housing departments have targets, highways departments have targets, and green infrastructure will not be allowed to compromise those targets. If it can help, that's fine. But if it means fewer houses on a particular plot of land, making room for green space, that's going to be difficult to achieve, especially when there's pressure to build more and to improve communications. I came across one example of this in relation to a highway. A voluntary body working with a small city authority on the edge of Antwerp have recently managed to plant a new woodland. And within a month of that woodland opening to the public with great fanfare and photography and so on, it was announced that a new road was needed and would be built through that space. Planning regimes are there to try and protect environmental interests, but they'll only work if they're enforced, and they will only work if the playing field is level for all developers. Developers will accept green infrastructure requirements as long as they know that all the other developers competing for the same piece of work have the same obligations. There's a presumption that grey is cheaper. It may not be, but the presumption exists because the costing of grey infrastructure is more familiar. Many authorities will have done this type of thing before and know whether a project estimate is reasonable or not compared with what they've seen before. Proving value at the moment is an academic preserve and is not accessible to people working at this level of local government. And smaller cities generally have issues over skills, workloads and finance. In a large authority, a large metropolitan authority, there might be a small department that deals with green issues. In one of these cities, it might be one person, and it might be a part-time person at that, who works on all of this kind of detail. And it's interesting that that in that chart we just saw, partnership with other departments is more problematic than partnership with external bodies, which again addresses this, this issue of silos within local authorities. It's difficult to break through the structural boundaries that exist within local authorities. Whereas partnership with an external body, you probably are focusing on the same outcomes. These are bodies like water authorities, environment agencies, coastal protection bodies, and so on. There's probably more synergy with those bodies than there is with other departments of the same organisation. And moving quickly on to making the case for green infrastructure. The general approach to evidence is to be sensitive to decision makers' expectations and to be selective in identifying the benefits. There are people who say, well, list everything that you might get from this, all of the green infrastructure gains, all of the ecosystem services. Others say it's better to be careful and to choose those benefits that will resonate most with the person making the decision. Dressing the project appropriately. Because GI is multifunctional, it's also multifaceted. And it means you can describe a project as making the place look nice, even if the purpose of the project is something more serious. Being aware of the political dimension means giving the decision maker some argument they can use when their proposal is challenged by their political rivals. The financial evidence is, of course, very important. It's not always just about cost, but cost is usually a big factor in the decision. And the green-grey choice, as I've said before, is a matter of confidence. Almost always there'll be some sort of cost-benefit analysis, but this will usually be limited to a payback period, and that's all. There won't be any monetization of the ecosystem services. Where there is, it uses rule of thumb calculations that have no real basis in evidential terms. That means there's an increasing need for more reliable data to forecast ecosystem service performance and the kind of gains that you get. At the moment, all decision makers are getting is bland, unquantified assurances that there will be ecosystem services gains. But that reliable data comes up against the limited access and the limited handling skills that exist in small authorities. And even where those skills are available, perhaps at regional or provincial level, demand on the time of the individuals concerned is extremely high. We noticed as well there was very limited use of monitoring. Nobody goes back to check, did we get what we were looking for from this project? And there's also very limited use of appraisal tools because there's no confidence in them. And they're far too difficult for people in smaller authorities to spend the time learning them and to spend time populating the databases in question. An ideal tool would be one that combines usability, comprehensiveness in dealing with all ecosystem services and not just one or a small number of, confidence that this is actually an accurate basis for calculation, that it has some credibility. But above all, balancing ideas of precision with ease of use and credibility. An ideal tool will not necessarily be perfect, but it will be easy to use and credible while being sufficiently accurate not to undermine the confidence of the user. We tested whether types of evidence that were social, environmental, or economic would be the most effective in getting a project approved. There's not a lot of difference between the results here. They're all fairly high, they're all fairly influential, with environmental coming out the most prominent of all. But when we tested whether direct evidence, in other words, impact on people, indirect evidence, impact on people's surroundings, and more general evidence, such as the more diverse and abstract opportunities, such as carbon capture and so on. The direct evidence scores by far the most strongly. Decision makers are looking for projects that provide visibility, immediacy, that are understood both by themselves and by the public, and that are more likely to offer publicity opportunities. So if you've got a long-term abstract project, then the best way to get approval for that will be to try to break it down into smaller, more short-term, more visible, and more direct resident gain phases. And in conclusion, well, there we are. The secrets of success: visibility, speed of results, benefits to residents, a sound business case with proof of value, selective multifunctionality, don't necessarily say everything, tailored to the priorities of the city and the decision maker. If you can achieve it, collaboration with internal as well as external partners, political and public support, evidenced through, for instance, consultation, funding in place, obviously, the capacity to deliver. We did actually come across one authority that had 40 projects in its pipeline, but only one person who was working on delivery. He said, I just can't do them. And elements of patience, timing, and luck in submission of the proposal. So what's next in this project after the report has been published? Well, the results are already feeding into work on the business model. For instance, they're suggesting that ecosystem services in smaller cities should not all be of the same value, that the results may need to be weighted to reflect the priorities in the city. The project will be engaging in a capacity building program, which we are starting to work on, and some of these results may feed into that to ground the extension of GI awareness in a survey of local authorities and from a local authority perspective. The report is going to go into the public domain very shortly, as is a summary document, which is rather more accessible. And we're also hoping, between Alex and myself, to produce some academic papers as well. So that's Nature Smart Cities, and that's what I've been up to for the last 12 months or so. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your interest in what I've been doing.
Well, does anyone have any questions for Phil?
Mark, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if there are any questions.
I have questions. I've got a billion questions. Can I go?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not being able to hear anybody.
Aha. You can't hear this? Mark, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Phil, it sounds like you could hear Mark. Is that right?
Phil, can you hear me or not?
I'm sorry, I missed that question.
Can you hear us now, Phil?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Okay, Audrey.
Okay, and you can hear me too then?
I can, Audrey, yes.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Great, well, that was really fascinating. Thank you, really interesting. I've got so many questions, I don't really know where to start. But one thing is you said functionality and be able to show multiple benefits of the green infrastructure. You said you had to be, if I understood correctly, you had to be selective about it, but then on the other hand, and not show everything. And on the other hand, you also suggest that you should have a comprehensive tool to evaluate everything. So I wasn't completely clear on what your message was on that.
Okay, well, the two things are for different purposes. The tool needs to look at all ecosystem service benefits to see which ones are the most prominent, where the biggest results are achieved. But my respondents thought there was little advantage to be gained in setting out all 12 or 18 or however you define ecosystem services and saying that all of these would be achieved because first of all it wouldn't be credible, and secondly you would confuse your decision maker. The decision maker wants something more pithy and more subtle to rule on, and doesn't want to be dragged into debates on things they don't understand. So that's why it's more useful, people feel, to be selective in the presentation, comprehensive in the analysis, selective in the presentation.
Depending on who you talk to, then.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, choosing the evidence to suit the occasion.
Very good. All right. Look, Bill, I have a question of my own.
Yeah.
On pages, in a few places, you showed us some histograms, and
Yeah.
histograms represented the columns of which represented the aggregation of answers to questions that were scored in a particular way.
Yeah.
You didn't show us any measure of variation around each of those columns, and I was thinking particularly, for example, if a score on average was 1, it could be because everybody said it was 1, or because half the people said it was 2 and half the people said it was 0.
Yeah.
Do you plan to present a measure of variation in your thesis?
Yeah. In the report, that measure of variation is identified. With the items at the top and the bottom of the bar charts, the variation is much lower. In the middle, it's much higher. So, for instance, on biodiversity, a third of respondents almost exactly said this was a high priority. A third said it was a moderate priority. A third said it was a low priority. So that information is in the report. It hasn't been overlooked. It wasn't included here because of pressures of time.
Yeah. Okay. I think in presentations, the representation of uncertainty is as important as a representation of the central tendency. It's probably a good idea to ensure it's there,
Okay.
particularly for presentations like this.
Okay.
Anyone else got questions for Phil? Audrey, we'll just wait to see if there are others, and then you can have the last question. Anyone else? I think, Audrey, you've got the floor. Go for it.
Great, thanks. I have many more if I can. One thing that I was curious about, so you politicians were were some of your respondents, right? So then you asked what were the obstacles, and political will was one of your potential answers. Now, it could be that some of your officers would have said political will, but it's doubtful that a politician would say political will is what's creating an obstacle. But a politician would say, well, it's competing interests. That's an obstacle. But in fact, competing interests and political will is a bit the same thing, I would argue.
Yes, I think I'd accept that. But in many of these authorities, if not all of them, politicians are in charge of particular service areas. So just as the officers in the housing department have targets to meet, the politician is responsible for, has to be answerable for whether those targets are met or not. So they're closely aligned with the direction, the service plan of the service area itself. It's when they meet in cabinet, that politician will have, I suppose, two roles. One, representing their department and answering challenges to their department, and the other, a more corporate role. I think many politicians find that quite a different balance, quite a difficult balance to work with. And because they're probably being attacked and criticised for what are seen as the weaknesses or failures in their department, they're more likely to err on that side rather than to look at the more corporate kind of issue. Authorities have tried to overcome that by developing corporate statements, corporate commitments, but those are not always particularly powerful, and they seem to be quite subject to the short-termism issues that we located. That there's much more credit, much more kudos attached to delivering a small project than there is to contributing to a much longer term and much vaguer kind of goal.
Can I have a very quick one?
Yeah, one more question before we have to close shop. So
Okay.
again, just to scan across to see if anyone has anything burning to ask. All yours, Audrey.
Okay, I hesitate between two, so I'll be very quick and Phil can answer one of them. One is you said that active travel was seen as damaging to biodiversity, and I'm really curious about why that would be the case. And then the other thing is that you saw no evidence of impact of the academic literature, and I wonder how you judge that, how you made that conclusion.
Okay. Well, as far as active travel is concerned, the issue that emerged as an example, really, that the active travel provisions in Cambridge, for instance, have been made largely concrete and have been criticised for damaging biodiversity in some of the areas that they pass through. I think that there's that risk exists elsewhere if it isn't already being experienced in that way. Now I've forgotten what your other question was. Sorry.
Why do you think that academic literature doesn't have any impact?
Because I don't see any evidence of it being made. People who work in smaller authorities, as I've noticed here, have much lower capacity to engage with anything other than the material on their desk, and they're struggling to keep up as it is. So academics have themselves identified a large gap between the academic output and the reality of practitioner life. And I think that's even more amplified in a smaller authority where there's no interrelationship other than exists through this project with any university or any academic input. It's all being driven by the pressures of the day. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of wider reading going on, wider informing. The workload is just too heavy to allow that.
All right, we better wrap up now. It's only a couple of minutes to go. I know Audrey's got lots more questions, but she can take them up with you directly. Thank you very much, Phil. And thanks everybody. Well done. Thank you, Phil.